Hello, and welcome to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. My name is Derek McCush. Across the world, corruption costs trillions of dollars that should have gone into social and environmental progress. Corruption steals from efforts to reduce poverty, to improve social services, and to build schools, hospitals, and roads. It leaves little room for democracy and systems of justice. In this episode of Human Rights Magazine, Sofia Gobin explores the concern with corruption in Brazil.
Hi, welcome to today's episode of Human Rights Magazine. I'm Sofia Gobin, and in this episode we'll be talking about a systemic issue that continues to challenge Brazilian society: corruption. Corruption in Brazil has deep historical roots, going all the way back to the colonial era, when exploitation and favoritism were widespread. Over the centuries, it's become deeply entrenched in many sectors, from politics to business. Some of the most notorious scandals, like the Petrobras Lava Jato scandal or car wash operation in 2014, exposed a vast network of corruption involving top politicians and major corporations. This investigation shook public trust and highlighted how corruption drains resources meant for public welfare, making social inequalities worse and undermining the rule of law. Today, we'll hear from three experts who have dedicated their careers to exposing, studying, and fighting corruption in Brazil. First off, we have Gregory Michener, an associate professor and founder of the Brazilian Open Data Initiative. Gregory's work on transparency and accountability has been key to pushing for open data practices and policy changes in Brazil. Afterwards, we'll hear from Fernanda Ogila, award-winning investigative journalist and research fellow at the University of Bologna. Fernanda studies the development and use of technology to monitor corrupt behavior. Lately, she's been focusing on Europe, looking how forms of influence, while not always illegal, can still lead to corruption. Finally, we'll be joined by Juliana Sakai, the operations director at Transparência Brasil. Juliana leads anti-corruption initiatives working to expose corrupt practices and push for legislative reforms. Her work strengthens civil society's role in holding officials accountable. Throughout our conversation, we'll get insights on the current state of corruption in Brazil and where we go from there. One of the key topics we'll touch on is the Lava Jato investigation. Once a symbol of hope in the fight against corruption, it has faced major setbacks in recent years. I asked our experts today how they see corruption in Brazil evolving, especially over the last decade. Gregory Michener, our first speaker, comes from a background in policy and a freedom of information. He's particularly concerned about recent legislative and judicial changes that have made the fight against corruption even harder.
So things have gotten very retrograde since Lava Jato. It's been, I would say, two steps forward, 2.5 steps back since I arrived here. I arrived here in 2009, and I witnessed and participated in and helped with the passage of certain laws, because my specialty is on freedom of information and transparency policies. And so I participated in events leading to the passage of the Freedom of Information Law, what we call a Lei de Acesso à Informação Pública here, right? But then they had all kinds of laws passed, including a conflict of interest law in 2013, also the anti-corruption law in 2013, and then a law on criminal organization, essentially racketeering law in 2013. And the two last laws that I'm talking about from 2013, which are the numbers are 12.846 and 12.850, I believe. Those laws were instrumental in creating the momentum for the Lava Jato, because they essentially empowered government agents, the federal police, and prosecutors to use plea bargains in the first time in history, really effectively in Brazil.
Gregory Michener also explained that plea bargains have become essential in Brazil's fight against corruption. By securing confessions from the accused in exchange for lighter sentences, Prosecutors can gather information that reveals corruption at higher levels, setting off a chain reaction exposing the political elite. He also talked about how a Supreme Court decision bolstered this approach by requiring jail time for white-collar convictions after an appeal, although many have still managed to avoid prison through legal routes like habeas corpus.
So if you were convicted of corruption after an appeal, you didn't have to necessarily go to jail, and most white collar criminals would not go to jail. They get out on what's called the habeas corpus, which is a writ that lawyers can provide saying, I want him out of jail because there's no necessary, he's not at risk of flight, etc., etc. And so, combined with the you're going to jail and the plea bargaining power, the Lava Jato had very strong leverage to get, um, criminal indictments because people were essentially tattletaling on each other. They essentially, so name 5 people who were involved in corruption and detail their crimes. And so it was a sort of snowballing thing where you had hundreds of politicians and basically the entire political elite in one way or the other with allegations of corruption, some more credible than others. After the impeachment of Dilma, uh, Congress gained a lot more power in general. With that, the conservative factions gained more power because they were the conservative, sort of the right that brought down Dilma and the PT, and the right became very empowered. And Bolsonaro, although he promised to cut down on corruption, he came in 2018 essentially on an anti-corruption and anti-workers party platform, but he failed to put that into action because his family started to become investigated by the federal police. And in order to save his family, he effectively sacrificed the Minister of Justice, who was, of course, the judge Sergio Moro, the famous sort of crusading judge who was in the front of the Lava Jato, the sort of one of the protagonists of the Lava Jato. And in sacrificing him from the Ministry of Defense, from the Minister of Justice, the whole Lava Jato and everything started to unravel, as well as the fact that Bolsonaro was completely reliant on his continued survival on Congress. So in exchange for essentially Congress not impeaching him, Congress could do whatever it wanted. And what it did was it rolled back a lot of the laws that had been passed, or even just laws that were in existence. And it passed some other laws like the abuse of authority law, which basically makes it much more difficult for prosecutors and the federal police to investigate corruption in Brazil. It weakened the administrative probity law, also making it very difficult to accuse someone of corruption falsely, and essentially just rolled the clock back. And then when the Supreme Court made this decision to revert the jail after an appeal, after a guilty decision on appeal, then essentially the whole thing fell apart. And Lula is in many ways in the same position as Bolsonaro. He doesn't have a majority in Congress, which means that the approval of things in Congress is contingent upon lawmakers in Congress agreeing to support him in Congress. He doesn't have a majority. And basically what they are asking for, what they've always asked for, is essentially, we want pieces of your government. Essentially, it's a coalition government, meaning that it has a record number of parties in the coalition and a record number of cabinet ministers right now, and they each control pieces of government. They don't want transparency. They certainly don't want anti-corruption because, the modus operandi of Brazilian politics is an elite pact for corruption, has been for decades, if not centuries. And so anti-corruption is really on the back foot, in the sense that under Lula, I think things are getting worse, in fact, as well as combined with the sort of chilling effect of freedom of expression in general, because if you say anything bad about Lula, well, then you're considered, in favor of Bolsonaro. It's either this sort of you're with us or against us type mentality.
We also discussed Justice Toffoli's recent decision to annul key evidence from the Lava Jato investigation. I wanted to understand the implications of this ruling for high-profile corruption cases in Brazil.
Probably the most important event that's happened in the last several months is that this Justice Toffoli, which you probably read about in the Financial Times or any other newspaper in The Economist, there's a Justice Antonio Toffoli who has, in September of 2023, he annulled evidence of essentially all the Aldebrecht uh, evidence, which essentially is sort of the bedrock case for the Lava Jato. And then he annulled the case basically altogether over the last month, and he's freed several prisoners who, for instance, Marcelo Aldebrecht, who was in prison for supposed to be serving 17 years, and he's now out. And so, this didn't start just because of Toffoli. I mean, I believe that, during Lula, it's absolutely crystal clear. The evidence is incontrovertible that a giant corruption system was operating in the National Petroleum Company. And, governors also were involved, like our governor here, Sergio Cabral, who was sentenced to almost 400 years in prison. And Sergio Cabral, as soon as Lula was elected, was essentially, as soon as Lula was elected, was actually in the semifinals week of I think the finals of the World Cup, just before Argentina won the World Cup, that he was released from prison on effectively very dubious grounds. And, he was a strong ally of Lula's as well. So, I mean, I'm not saying that Lula is necessarily, the headmaster of this corruption, but there's no question that during his governments, right, 2006, he was involved in the Mensalon scandal at the highest levels of government. I mean, his chief of staff, what you call Casa Civil, you probably know, had to resign because of that scandal. And several people were in prison. More than 30 people were in prison. I wrote an article on that scandal with Carlos Pereira. It was published in 2016 in the Journal of Latin American Studies on the Mensalon. But that was the first scandal, and that was essentially a vote buying scandal where where the Workers' Party was systematically buying votes in Congress. And effectively, the Petrobras scandal was the same thing, whereby parties aligned with the PT were in on getting kickbacks from inflated contracts in Petrobras in exchange for their votes in Congress. So, I mean, coalition politics in Brazil has shown itself to be a source of major corruption. And this is sort of, for corruption experts, this is a point of where there's no debate. I mean, these oversized coalitions, the fact that Brazil has the most fragmented party system in the world, meaning it's got the most parties of any country in the world by more than a third. Like Indonesia is second place, I think it has got a third less effective number of parties than Brazil. I mean, these systems are they don't work for providing good government. They work for making it so that parties will essentially hold the executive branch ransom in order to get their votes. And so that's the situation currently.
I also talked to Professor Michener about what efforts and reforms he thought needed to be taken moving forward.
Well, I think that the Supreme Court needs to be reformed so that, first of all, they stop flip-flopping on matters of huge consequence like this, prison after a first appeal. Essentially, if you're a white-collar criminal and you have money, you've stolen enough money, you effectively will never go to jail because you can run out the clock by buying appeals. You have a total of 4 appeals, but those appeals can take, 10 to 20 or 30 years, depending. It's really up to the discretion of the Supreme Court because The Supreme Court has what's called a privileged forum, meaning that if you're a deputy, a governor, if you're a senator, if you're the president, if you're a mayor, then you can only be judged criminally by the Supreme Court, which first of all has no criminal competence. It's not a criminal court, right? Which is one strike against it. But the second thing is that they can choose not to prosecute. They can choose to just essentially let it go because they've got too much on their docket, right? And they've done that many times. It's only when popular opinion gets behind it. But the Supreme Court, the way it functions as a last court of appeal, as well as a constitutional court, is very silly design. I mean, in Canada or the US and other countries, it only works as a constitutional court. You don't have the court working as a last court of appeal because there's simply too much to take care of. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of cases awaiting the judgment of the Supreme Court as a final court of appeal, and it's just silly. It's especially silly that they're responsible for criminal cases. Right? There should be a specialized criminal case in Finland, for example. There's a court of impeachment, which is exactly what we should have in Brazil, is a court of impeachment that deals with improbity. Because when you have improbity, this sets, you know, not only does it tear up society by creating cynicism and distrust of government, it steals money from citizens. It actually encourages, it's shown to encourage crime in general. It's called the broken window effect. You can look it up on Wikipedia. It's essentially when there's broken windows in your neighborhood, people are more likely to break windows. It's the same with crime. If your elite are creating and are providing the example of crime, you're going to have more crime, which is exactly what's happened in Brazil. You've got this impunity, and now you've got PCC, which is the Primeiro Comando do Capital, the giant criminal organized gang that's now in over 20 countries, right? They've expanded so much, and this is not a coincidence. This is because you've got essentially an elite that doesn't punish corruption, and so it's expanded to criminal organizations as well. And so, the Supreme Court and the whole criminal justice system, white collar criminal justice system, needs to be reformed drastically. I mean, this is the first thing that needs to happen. So, in terms of, I don't think transparency is as important as, I mean, it's certainly very important, but the priorities are really reforming the political system. I mean, I personally think that the coalition presidential system of Brazil is a fountainhead of corruption.
Dr. Michener also emphasized that greater transparency and public accountability, including a public registry of corruption cases independent of the media, are necessary to prevent legal annulments and combat the collective amnesia surrounding past corruption. Next up, I spoke with Professor Odila about the efforts of Brazil's accountability systems and how they have diminished since Lava Jato. She pointed out that there's been less action from prosecutors and new laws seem to only protect politicians, making it increasingly difficult to grasp the full extent of ongoing corruption in Brazil.
Corruption is kind of a hidden activity that we don't know much unless we do have people reporting it, people investigating it. But what we can say for sure is that we saw two things 10 years after. The task force that was engaged in the car wash was dismantled. So we see that the prosecution service is not that engaged in investigating corruption. So what we've been seeing actually is a backlash in many ways possible. So we do have, more administratively speaking, the prosecution service kind of dismantling the thing, the political elite reacting to those who were investigating and became politicians. And I'm not saying there are no reasons or grounds for kind of punishing them, because they also made mistakes. But also we've been seeing a lot of backlashes regarding the legislation achievements that we had in the past years. So the political class mainly members of the lower house and the Senate, they've been passing a lot of legislation to kind of protect themselves. Mm-hmm. And also they passed an abuse of power legislation to try to kind of, I don't know even if the word, but to try to contain abuses from the law enforcers. So I think right now the current status is, it seems that the accountability system, especially the top-down one, is weaker than it was before. And this raises concern about what's going on with the corruption that I'm pretty sure is still happening, but I cannot tell you exactly what is going on because with no investigation, it's hard to say, right?
Professor Odila also shared her insights on how recent actions by both former President Bolsonaro and current President Lula have raised concerns about the independence of crucial institutions, especially the prosecution service and the Supreme Court. Under Lula's earlier presidency, she explained that there was a practice of appointing the head of prosecution service based on a list voted on by prosecutors, which Bolsonaro discontinued and Lula has not revived in his current term.
It's a kind of a sign that he's appointing someone who looks like that could be making his life easier. As we had during the Bolsonaro's term, the head of the prosecutor service, he was kind of quite docile and he wasn't creating any issues for the government in terms of creating investigations. Another thing that we saw is that Lula has been appointing to the Supreme Court people who are very close to him, like his personal lawyer, and then the Minister of Justice. So he's appointing friends to the Supreme Court, and to me, Bolsonaro did the same. And to me, is a clear sign that they want to protect themselves, because it's the Supreme Court that takes action against the president in Brazil. So we see kind of all the law enforcement main actors kind of controlled. And to me, this is a way, kind of political. They are trying to survive politically because Lula in the past had many issues with the Supreme Court, the prosecutor service. But still, to me, is a problem because we are weakening the institutions, right? The independence of the institutions. So I'm pessimist in this regard.
As a reoccurring pattern in Brazilian politics, corruption seems to be a constant concern in the lives of Brazilian citizens. Fernanda explained to me that while petty corruption, like paying bribes for everyday services, persists and is perceived to some extent, the focus and major problem still lies in grand corruption.
So if you look at the polls, ordinary people, they don't report experience with corruption as much as they perceive top-level corruption as a main widespread issue in Brazil. Mm-hmm. So we have this kind of discrepancy of thinking Brazil is super corrupt, but not experiencing it in your daily activities. But when you talk about grand corruption, to get contracts, to be appointed, and then to get access to politicians, so we do have these practices that they are not entirely legal, like, I don't know, campaign financing, lobbying, revolving doors. Sometimes they're not even regulated. Lobbying in Brazil is still not regulated, but they can be corrupted practices. And I think in Brazil, they're very likely to be used to get benefits on the expense of the collective, I would say. So I think there is, yes, this kind of feeling that there is, in Portuguese, we say, ele rouba, mas faz. So he steals but gets things done. That could be a sign of what you're saying. Or all politicians are the same. There is this feeling, but again, regarding the politicians, not necessarily the entire country, But it's hard to tell. After the car wash, one of the first measures taken still back in 2014 was forbidden companies to finance parties and campaigns. So now what we have is a kind of public funding. We didn't have it before in the volume we have now. And individuals can still donate, but up to a certain percentage of their revenue in the past year. And it was an attempt to reduce corruption related to campaign donations, but who can guarantee that there are not off the record kind of contributions or any way to circumvent the legislation? So I think Brazil still faces issues regarding grand corruption, more than petty corruption, in short. But again, it's not just a problem of Brazil, right?
I asked Professor Odila what she believed to be the next steps in terms of transparency and accountability moving forward.
Good question, because if you look at Brazil, Brazil is playing by the book. So I think it's one of the, at the federal level, one of the most transparent countries I've ever seen in terms, it's very easy to get access to campaign donations, now regarding individuals than before regarding companies, and expenditures, for example. We do have e-agenda, so you can access all the meetings that politicians had, sometimes explaining to details the goal of the meeting. So it's everything open, public, searchable. We do have, for a long time now, all the salaries from the president to the cleaner, public available, monthly available. We do have a lot of information. So transparency is not necessarily an issue on the federal level regarding the federal executive, but then the Senate, the lower chamber, the judiciary is still more complicated, but it's still going on the same way. What I think the thing is, civil society is not that strong as we would like to. So I think we need pressure. I'm convinced that politicians in Brazil, they are reactive. So under pressure, they take certain actions, and if they perceive that their re-election are not in risk, they don't do much. So we need more kind of a social oversight, I would say. Social accountability is one thing that we need, and better mechanisms to avoid backlashes. And this is tricky in terms of legislation. I mean, this is tricky because, of course, if we see legislation very kind of rigid, we don't improve them. But on the other hand, if they are very flexible, you can kind of change them according to the political mood. And this is something that we've been seeing. So especially regarding accountability, we should have more kind of control on the regulations and the legislation we've been seeing. But in the end, we need to vote for better politicians, I think, and control them. It's not just a matter of voting and that's fine. It's kind of monitoring them, asking, complaining, overseeing them. I don't know. Sometimes I think we should be better citizens to have better politicians. And because, man, if you wait for them to do the work, they are not doing it. And it's kind of clear that cannot expect much from them. This is a shame, but this is the reality.
During our conversation, Professor Odila explained how some civic groups and watchdog organizations in Brazil have adapted their strategies to navigate the politically charged landscape, especially since COVID-19. While there are new tools and resources being developed to increase transparency and promote anti-corruption, many times they get discontinued due to lack of use and funding. These groups have had to find ways to stay effective without being drawn into the intense polarization that defines the country's political climate.
I think they wanted to escape the polarization, the political polarization, and not being seen as one of the sides of the spectrum. And it's true because corruption is not a right-wing thing or a left-wing thing. It's corruption, especially in Brazil, prevails all the spectrum. We have issues. We've been having issues with all sorts of politicians, and I think it was a survival strategy to kind of keep doing what they do without being recognized as someone from one side or the other, I think. So these people who've been kind of doing social control and social monitoring without claiming they are right or left, they didn't want to get closer to this new group that emerged. So they stopped saying they were fighting corruption, and they started saying, no, we are doing civic monitoring. We're promoting transparency. They try to refrain themselves to avoid the political polarization. And to me, this is a very interesting thing. They keep fighting corruption, but the way they presented themselves, especially during Bolsonaro's government, now I think they kind of are trying to get traction again, but it's still it's very slow.
Professor Odila and I also talked about how politicians have leveraged corruption as an electoral tool. She noted that in 2018, Bolsonaro and others used anti-corruption platforms to win elections, but once they were in power, they faced their own corruption scandals as well. By 2022, corruption was no longer a major political focus. I asked Professor Odila about her thoughts on the potential effects of corruption on democratic backsliding over the next decade, and here's what she had to say.
Man, I think I'm waiting for the new scandal because it's a matter of time. What concerns me the most is the fact that the law enforcement agencies, so the Office of the Controller General, the Federal Police, the Prosecution Service, the Court of Accounts, the Supreme Court, they are not as independent as we would like. And then this kind of compromises not only democracy, obviously it does, but also the chances that we are going to discover the next scandal, because we depend on them. They are the ones with the best tools. Unless someone comes to public and whistleblow something, denounces something, reports something, it's very unlikely that the biggest scandals we had in Brazil, these agencies, they were active and in investigation and revealing things. So I fear that even if we have someone blowing the whistle or coming public to reveal something, the reaction would not be the one we would like. Investigating, send to trial those who are under suspicion and punishing those proved to be guilty. But still, it's kind of hard to say what's going on. I fear that we are going to believe everything is fine. And another thing I've been thinking a lot is that Brazil is still very divided. The polarization of Bolsonaro is still very strong with a loyal base of supporters who tried to, Bolsonaro and his allies, to organize a coup d'etat in Brazil. So sometimes I fear that people are being more lenient to Lula now and to his government, fearing that we go back to a dictatorship. So it's not good for democracy as well, because we are impacting its quality, but we are stuck in this difficult game in which we don't want to attack someone who looks like a more Democrat than the other one. But on the other hand, we are letting things going on without knowing if they are going on in the best way or not. So hard to tell. It's very hard to predict the future. I wish I could, But the only thing I can say is that we saw this incremental approach to accountability in Brazil. So, and it has never been straightforward. We would give two steps ahead, one back, one to the side, but we were evolving. And suddenly we saw a backlash in all ways and forms, and corruption being used as the main, it was instrumentalized in many ways. And then it's not good as well, because I want organizations, institutions, civil society fighting corruption, but fighting with the rule of law, with all the guarantees that innocent people are not going to be penalized. But it became a card in the political game. And this is also concerning, right? The wrong use of anti-corruption. So I hope we find a way to improve the quality of the institutions. And another thing that I've been thinking a lot, the Office of the Controller General, it's a very important institution. It has ever been since it was created in 2001, and it has been improving over the years. But I saw that they are kind of also reframing themselves, and they are not fighting corruption anymore, but they're improving integrity. And I can understand that in the political discourse, if you improve integrity, it's easier to sell this than if you're fighting corruption, because then you assume there is corruption to be fought. But I hope it's for real. It's not just a way to rebrand yourself and do not improve the mechanisms. And recently we saw one newspaper, Brazilian newspaper called O Estado de São Paulo, Estadão. They published that because the head of this agency, this is the anti-corruption agency in the federal level, in the executive. He used to be a lawyer, and he took a leave of absence of his law firm. His girlfriend is still there. And he had important clients like Facebook, like an airline, Gol, it's a Brazilian one, the mining company Vale, and he's been receiving them to talk about topics that are not very clearly related to the agency. And we keep thinking, if the head of the anti-corruption agency is having this kind of meetings that they're open, you can find information about them in the system, there is nothing hidden, but it's still very weird, right? It's not his role to receive his former clients, because this is important. All these companies are clients of his own law firm that now he's not leading anymore, but his girlfriend is still there. So we see signs here and there that things are not that towards integrity, but we don't see a lot of public reaction on this.
Absolutely. It's so complicated to think of and terrifying to look forward, but we have to hope, I suppose.
Yeah, but you know what? When I think, okay, Brazil is, there is this saying that Brazil is not for beginners. And it's true. But when I see things in the UK, for example, or even in the European Commission, or here in Italy, they are not that different. In a way, maybe the type of corruption changes a bit, the players, but still, we do have a lot of important companies trying to gain access to benefit at the expense to the others. The game is a bit the same, I would say. Maybe it changed the form of corruption, but still, I don't know. If you think about the UK and donors of the party getting contracts, or former prime ministers or cabinet ministers who were lobbyists or lobbying to gain access to their clients and using their position to benefit specific companies. It's a bit the same, isn't it? Maybe this is politics, and they forgot to tell us. that it works like that.
I'm slowly discovering that throughout my degree. I was just wondering about your personal project that you were telling me about and what you're working on at the University of Bologna currently.
So yeah, we are working on a project that looks at civil society initiatives and anti-corruption technologies. I'm looking specifically at Brazil and Uruguay, and the idea is trying to understand how people get together, how they develop the tools, and which are the main challenges and issues they face. And the main challenge is convincing people to use their tools by far. And this impacts outcomes and a high dependence on funding because these things kind of cost money. Mm-hmm. And we're starting a new project, but now more focused on Europe and using all these forms of influence that are not necessarily illegal, but can result in corrupted practices.
Very interesting. I think it's about to end, but I really appreciate you talking to me, and I'll be in touch with the information about the article.
If you need anything, let me know. And if you can use my name to contact Lucio and Juliana, there is no problem.
That'd be incredible. Thank you so much.
Okay. Good luck.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Our last interviewee is Juliana Sakai. She's the operations officer at Transparency Brazil, an anti-corruption organization that works to promote integrity and transparency in public and private institutions. The group focuses on exposing corruption, monitoring government actions, and advocating for reforms to improve accountability. Ms. Sakai talks about her work to make Brazil's political parties more transparent and accountable.
Okay, so I think that, as you pointed, after so we had a clear weakening of a lot of systems of control in Brazil of to combating corruption, and I think that there is this on the side of the agencies, and also on the side of society, this perception that this fight against corruption was a problem and was actually what brought us to the extreme right. So I think the state of corruption in Brazil is right now that it's not something very sexy to talk about. It's not really something that the parties wanted to deal with, and actually they take advantage of the situation to decrease the controlling system in general. I would say not only the parties, but actually there is a lot of things going on, not only inside the legislative itself, but also on the side of the judiciary, where we are seeing the recurrent decisions against the Lava Jato itself, right? So right now it's really not the best time for fighting against corruption. Right now, not something that people are talking so much, and that there is no policy really in terms of fighting corruption, and you can see this also in the government and in the office of the Comptroller General, for example.
Next up, we talked about the broader effects of corruption on Brazilian society, especially its impact on social hierarchy and power dynamics.
Well, at the end of the day, we have like an elite that actually can still use their money in their favor, and instead of using in favor of who needs at most, right? And I think that this is what we are talking about all the time. So we are like discussing tributary reform right now, which actually quite surprising for Brazil. I mean, in terms of like how we have been able to in a lot of months to simplify the tributary regime, but when it comes to see who is being privileged, who has access to power, you see that there are a lot of exemptions coming out to this tributary reform, which means that the same old groups have sufficient power to promote their own interests, right? We have I'm talking here in corruption in a very broad term, like in terms of who is able to capture the state. But even if you look at, for example, how the judiciary system in Brazil is able to capture a lot of revenues as well for their own benefit.
Sakai expressed concerns about powerful Brazilian politicians gaining increased discretion over public spending, leading to funds being allocated based on political favoritism rather than technical needs. She is generally pessimistic about the.
I don't see really a movement right now again that could support the fight against corruption. It's really a very systematic problem here, where you see you have like the all the movements since 2013 that there was like civil society movement that in which they point corruption as a huge problem. Civil society point as a huge problem, and then you have like Dilma's impeachment, and then you have like Bolsonaro coming to power, and then you have nothing to actually make all these old problems better. Actually, they are worsening. Actually, you have like all the control system getting worse, and the decisions that were made to destructure the Lava Jato. You see, they going, they are disappearing. And so everything is being undone. It's not getting worsening, and you don't have an answer for the old problems. So there isn't. I don't see very much a way out, nor for trust in political institutions, because we're still going to see a lot of corruption problems and scandals in the coming months. No? So it will continue, it will appear somehow, and you don't have an answer because the structures to fight against corruption were dismantled, and no one is really interested in strengthening right now, except from the public ministry. Maybe the federal public ministry is restructuring again right now. But yeah, they say that it's being reconstructed. It's being reconstructed right now, everything.
To wrap up this episode of Human Rights Magazine, one thing is clear. Corruption remains a very deeply rooted issue in Brazil. My conversations with Gregory Michener, Fernando Gila, and Juliana Sakai paint a very sobering picture. Recent setbacks, like the dismantling of Lava Jato and weakened oversight, have only deepened the problem and further eroded public trust. Michener sheds light on the complexities brought by these new legislative challenges, while Ogila highlighted how corruption is evolving, making it harder for existing tools to keep up. And Juliana Sakai, sharing her on-the-ground experience, expressed real pessimism about the state of anti-corruption efforts today. However, despite these challenges, the ongoing commitment and passion of these experts and advocates that I talked to today provides me with hope for the future. So thank you so much to these guests for allowing me to interview them. Their work underscores the importance of vigilance and resilience in the fight for transparency and justice.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. The podcast is brought to you by the Upstream Journal. I invite you to consider supporting the program and the magazine with a contribution through PayPal as you explore other episodes.